Good day everyone, and hello, I'm Noctis Corvus, but Noctis for short. This video ended up getting away from me a little. I intended in part for this to be a bit of a shorter thing, yet as the length proves, that didn't exactly happen. So maybe grab a snack since I, thankfully, have a few things to waffle about this time too. It certainly wasn't as straightforward as I had hoped when doing the sketch. Well, even then the sketch wasn't so simple as normal, which sort of said it all. It definitely set a precedent for the rest of the thing. Though that is something I will touch on a bit more later. For now, I instead want to mention that this is the first instalment of a new series I want to introduce here. See, dreams are something that's always interested me and my creative side, though often something I end up avoiding in favour of drawing narratives and characters more established. I favour the drawings that are easier for me to explain to others whenever they ask, since, well, it's less awkward than working around dream logic, especially when there is no logic to most of the dreams I have. For this series, though, the images in the video will instead push a little beyond my usual comfort zone to depict these moments, atmospheres, and environments, rather than my usual method of creating ideas. Normally, I may take a small section, maybe a feeling from a dream, and rework it into something with more sense and more of a clear narrative. With this, I want to instead embrace the dreams in their whole. That means the strange dreams may have their odd elements, and the more normal ones, like this one, reflect the moments I mainly recall. I suppose I ought to let you in on the dream, since it seems like the next logical step, with it shaping the entire piece. Though I must admit that this dream was one of the more normal ones. It had its oddities, but nothing that really seeped into the chosen moment, since this scene is really a fraction of what I remember. I only chose to draw this one since it stuck with me for years at this point, as the icon of the overall dream as opposed to what the majority of it was. See, the dream itself featured some sort of forest. It was an odd one too, having pine trees next to grand oak ones and then thin birch branching between the narrow gaps. It didn't feature one type of tree, or at least one style. Instead, it was a patchwork of different locations all layered over the others, to a point that it didn't equate to a single location or picture that I would recognise if I was to look back on it, and the flowers were very much the same. The leaves didn't allow any light through either. I can't recall if it was day or night in the dream since I had it years ago, and only remember this as a piece of art I wanted to make, but also recorded the dream in a stray notebook I used to keep near my bed for new ideas. I have a bad habit of having my best ideas just before I go to sleep, and either note them down or lose them, so this sorted it. For the dream, it ended up as a random connection of sentences that made sense to me the moment I woke up. A few hours later it made less sense, but it was decipherable. But back to the sky. Well, the lack of it. I've had a few dreams where there was no sky. Not even a cloud, really. There was this one dream I will definitely be featuring in the future that is sort of my go-to dream to talk about this happening. Yet, in this one, the sky may have been there, yet out of sight behind the trees, or it could have been a void that doesn't quite look like the sky of every day. The mismatched trees did agree to prevent all light seeping through though, which instead left the forest rather dark and awkward to navigate. And I was wandering. I don't remember if I had a goal in the dream. It is unlikely that I did. As I do recall just sort of walking between trees and their roots whilst pushing past bushes without a path in sight. I would say it began more as a nightmare with the lack of direction in the dark, yet I do know there wasn't a sense of dread or fear. It was almost as if it were in the middle of the afternoon and I had been casually walking somewhere I had always known, despite the unique nature. Between the shadows of the trees, there would occasionally be glimpses of bright eyes. I recall the yellow, the typical for such a scene, and the individual case of blue eyes between the bushes. But they weren't a threat. More, they felt like a curious animal that only sought to watch, despite the fact that the forest made no sound and didn't carry the signs of an animal. I probably should have been a bit more on edge about that. Yet I kept walking. Now, later in the dream is where the image came from. I did consider making this video feature the first half with the trees and eyes. I could very well still create a piece of it, yet decided ultimately to create from this moment. At one point in the wandering, the trees began to thin ever so slightly when compared to the main bulk of the forest's heart. The gaps between opened small amounts, and it gave more room to the lower lying bushes that would carpet the ground. Though, in all of it, networks of branches still wove themselves together from all kinds of trees to cover the sky. As the trees thinned, however, water began to cut through the silence. A river parted them under their own canopy, one with rocks and sand at its bed, with taller stones towering out of sections of the water, unlike what is seen here. One part created a row of stepping stones, where the first rose was placed, another in a stream and floating. Whilst the roses I drew were red, the first few happened to be white. Yet they continued down the river as I followed the bank. Eventually, as the flowers grew pink, they came to a bridge that I just wanted to cross. And it was on that bridge that I finally saw this scene that sort of stuck with me until now. Since, from there, I was able to look down into the river where I saw this scene I'm working on, with a woman in the water covered in the flowers they hold. I actually chose to remove some aspects from the dream, despite what I initially said. See, in the dream the flowers were more part of her. They weren't just hiding what was below, they had consumed what was below. I will touch on that later though. Yet, of it all, the woman was peaceful. She was just lay in the water without moving as she blinked at the canopy above. The flowers continued to flow from around her, travelling into the water and being carried away, despite the logic of the currents. Some went against the water flow and others with it. Yet the image sort of stuck with me when I woke up, to a point that my note of the dream began with this moment and worked backwards. Even in the original note, I detail the rocks under the water and the lily pads with the leaves. The flowers were the key part and the figure too, though the way they were indifferent to it all remained as well. Really, their indifference was the key part of it all. But the dream ended soon after. I began to wander again, leaving her to the flowers and rejoining the eyes, yet woke up and made the notes. Though the moment stuck with me. It remained in the back of my mind for years, whilst the sketches I would do to capture what I recall never quite lived up to the picture I had in my head, and intended to work towards it. So it often ended up on the mental shelf, waiting for the moment I wanted to approach it with a sketch that matched how it felt. Doing it this way then sort of helped me, since it gave me further idea to work towards, and waiting meant I could see more references for it. And I know it isn't an idea I've never seen before. My art friend had some references that were similar to it during one of our projects, and there are photo shoots easily found that look like this. When looking for the sketch, I even looked at the image of Ethereal in the lake as a starting point before getting the basics down. Yet, with the previous point, I meant my own skill, since then I got busy for the longest time with other ideas before finally sitting and creating it. And I am rather satisfied with the outcome too. A key thing I wanted to get right was the atmosphere of the piece and that moment, especially since that was the core aspect of the memory from the dream, more than the actual actions and events. I mean, originally, I was going to make it darker. Off camera, I considered adding the usual night effects, and trying to make it look as if this woman was in the darkness that was similar to when I saw her. Ultimately, I don't. The dream wasn't spooky or scary. It wasn't meant to be a negative sense of the dark, and adding those effects made the image more sinister in some sense. Besides, the memory is lighter. There is a clarity to it that I remember, and the woman wasn't in the appropriate amount of shade for the environment. If she had been, then I wouldn't have been able to see the colours to the flowers as clearly or details to her face and eyes. But there was a sense of them when I woke up, and I knew the shadows wouldn't fit the piece. It just wouldn't line up with the feeling that I had been aiming for. I wanted it to be lighter, with that sense of calm to it. I didn't want it to seem sinister or creepy, but instead capture the serenity that I can recall. It's why I kept the river clean, with the bottom in sight, as if the person could just be lying in it without having to worry about the depth. A rock, that would be a valid concern with the others around, but not that the river was too deep for someone. It's also why I made the water more still. I could have added the currents to it, but the water travelled slowly in the dream anyway, and adding it in would have been too much visually. It would have added a sense of motion that it didn't need or have, potentially adding urgency if it looked to move too quickly, as if she could be swept away. So I instead kept it rather calm, peaceful, and more at ease than my other ideas. It's also why I chose to keep the flowers as they end up. More on those shortly though, since I have a fair amount I want to touch on with them. Yet at this point I do want to touch on the process of the piece, since I did try something a little different with this one in the sketching phase. I also changed a few of the later stages, but I can get into that post-sketching change. Normally when I'm doing a sketch, I will do a bunch of small thumbnails of it to work out the basic gist of the piece and basic ideas of composition. This is where I'll explore a handful of variants for one piece, and this can range from 2 thumbnails to 10 or even more. But it allows me to sort of explore my options and work out which elements work, and then which I want to combine before actually beginning to lay down the basics on the page. It's then built up over time and many layers, yet I often leave it once I have the details in place and go straight ahead into the base colours, therefore leaving the sketch as a set of lines. However, for this one, I began to add various layers of colour into the shading phase, since I began to get confused with various aspects all layering over one another, especially in areas like the sleeves, where they were needed yet mostly covered by her hair, so the lines all merged into one thing. In areas like this, the colours made it easier to visually separate the different sections to work with, also making it easier during the base colours. It then sort of spread to the other areas as well, which let me mess with the colours too for a while. But it also helped see what would come to be underwater compared to the above areas, which made me more confident in the sketch for a change. I've also found that since I did it for this piece, I've actually been doing it for more and more on some of my other sketches, since I did most of them the same day. For example, I have a few ideas based around bubbles sketched out and another sketch of some figures dancing that I am working on that both have the same stages of the sketch as this one. So yeah, it looks like I have a semi-new process with the sketches, and it may be an obvious stage people do, but I've been enjoying it and just thought of it so it's new to me, which is why I thought it was worth mentioning. Especially since it lets me work out colours in an earlier stage, with changes possible later, the more that I look at it. The more I look at any piece, the more it changes. From there though, the process was relatively the same. I say relatively since I did experiment in the shading stages too, since I realised some of my brush settings had changed without me realising. See, I have it normally set to a certain way of mixing colours, varying by brush, as Clip Studio has 2 options as far as I can recall at this moment. I'm doing the voiceover later, so I've not got it open at the moment. It's got one where it mixes the colours on the screen, and then it's got one where it mixes it more like actual paint. However, I realised that my watercolour brush had set itself back to default. Who knows how long ago. So I finally set it back to the other option. I really can't remember the name for it at the moment. And finally experimented again with the blending I was used to, and that, to be honest, I prefer. But you'll likely see that I mess with the colours I'm including in the layers of shading with purples and blues or yellows added, rather than sticking to the more comfortable tones that I often would favour of just lightening or darkening the same colour. This is something I enjoy doing too. I mean, I love messing with colours and testing what works and what doesn't to sort of determine what looks good. The only downside to it all is that more often than not, I end up having to start over and paint over things time and time again before I find the right balance. It was really in art courses that I stopped with this approach. Besides, in my simpler drawings, the simpler shading just fits the piece better, so I go with that more often than not. With this one I was doing a bit more experimenting, so it turned out quite well. It is a goal of mine though. I want to try and continue to move beyond that established comfort zone in the coming drawings, sort of find a new comfort zone I can then continue to push and go beyond. Anyway, post-shading, my process was then the same as always. I used fewer final effects, more added an overlay to the piece to help with the colours present and to push that final effect. Yet that was about it since it was all it needed. The main bulk of this drawing had been spent on the shading, despite the fact that I lost track of time frequently when working on it. Honestly, I would have no clue how long this piece took if it weren't for the recording, especially for the more tedious sections that I'm about to get into. But it brings us to the challenges of the video, and I have a certain bone to pick with a few things this time. First up, those roses. Just the roses. Okay, it is entirely a challenge of my own making in this case. However, I usually tend to keep flowers as an impression of the details, so that means I don't normally draw the petals often and very rarely get into the finest of lines with them, since, large scale, it wouldn't be seen anyway, so it hardly matters, in my opinion. Besides, the impressions are fun for me to do and they usually look good too. They don't look unfinished, and usually complement the piece quite well. Too much detail can often draw the eye away from what actually matters, and I often include flowers to complement, not steal. However, they are the focal point in this piece, and Flat Colour Me definitely forgot that when adding them in. So, when shading them, purposefully a step left until last. I then did my usual basic shading on them, where the shape is more meant to imply that they're natural, and the colour then implies that they're flowers. It's a process I used on Lust in that video, if anyone's familiar with it. However, in this one, it just looked unfinished. It was unfinished, I'm going to be honest. And it just looked like I couldn't be bothered halfway through, if I happened to leave them like that, as I often would. This thing is relative to the piece, naturally, since one technique won't ever be perfect in all cases. Yet I ended up knowing immediately that I would need to add more to them since they are a core element. So after a 5-minute break, since I had been drawing for 3 hours straight at this point, I got into the details where I still kept it rather simple. I didn't want to suddenly overdo them and have them overpower the piece, since they're already on one of the upper layers and they already aren't being washed out by the water like most of the layers below. So they do demand a lot of attention as is. I also didn't want to get caught up on the smallest of details that wouldn't be seen anyway. I experimented a bit from there and worked out a fairly basic way I could finish them up, without spending the next year drawing roses and only roses. In the end, I do believe I found the middle ground I wanted. See, I had some simple lines, mostly focusing on the way that they spiral around each other so that they read a little more like the pattern of the flower. From there it was a case of simple shading and lighting, and that was really all it took to finish them up and sell that they are in fact roses, without taking away from the rest of the piece. They did cause me a bit of a headache though. As I said, I'd already been drawing at this point for 3 hours without realising, and this was the final thing I had to do. Normally I would have left it and came back to it after a while, but I was already in the zone with it and the end was in sight, so I was going to do it one way or another. And it didn't make sense to come back after like a day or so for 5 minutes of a piece. It was just a little repetitive, as I had to double and triple check that I didn't miss any of them. Also, if you leave a comment saying that I missed one, I will be checking the piece like 50 times, because I'm fairly sure I didn't, but that isn't like 100%. There have been one too many times I've finished a piece and then realised hours or days later, usually once the poster's been shared, that I missed the smallest of thing on it. Like once I realised I forgot a hair tie of all things, which I did go back and fix the next time I had my drawing set up out. Definitely something I still joke about now though. Though in this piece, the flowers really were my final challenge. They also gave me an earlier issue in the sketching phase that I've already touched on briefly. See, the dream had the flowers sort of growing from the skin of the figure, and there were parts where they were part of the woman. Naturally, if I had included it, it would have thrown off too much of the atmosphere I was trying to create from memory. I also don't often draw too much gore. It's something that I've never really explored, and if I have, it's always been in a cleaner sense, or cuter? Maybe it's the wrong word, but it isn't realistic and often lacks details. Mainly because full gore is something that I don't find fun to personally draw. And in this image, I wanted that sense of calm. Naturally, adding the details of roses growing would have been against the atmosphere, and it would have been eerie rather than calm. So I instead had the roses growing over parts of the figure. The roots weren't really something I wanted to recall too much either, just how they grew. So it wasn't something too vital to the piece that I considered a non-negotiable. I instead valued the calm in the piece that the flowers alone brought. Plus, honestly, if I'd added the flower roots, then I would have been fighting with there being too much detail for the eye to focus on. I mean, already there are the lily pads, leaves, the figure, and flowers. Not to mention the rocks under the water as well and the details of the sand. The hair then takes up a lot of the focus with the way it ripples, so to add more narrow lines to the roots, around places like the hair and the dress, it would have been too much. Maybe if the water wasn't there I would have considered it, but again, the water and the shading just would have made it too much. But that is about all of the trouble given by the roses. The only other issue I had with the piece had been the water, ironically. It isn't something I tend to draw too often, which usually means I'm left winging it whenever I do decide to include it. Shading it is the main issue for me. What with the light and the reflections and the way that it moves. But this one wasn't too much of a fight. See, there wasn't much to reflect on the water, and it was shallow enough where the bottom was visible, so it wasn't too murky either. I could lower the opacity alone, and it already read somewhat like water. Naturally, the shading was then the challenge, since it could cement it as water or push it towards the regions of glass. But keeping the shading simple and following the sense of the rippling definitely pulls the end result over towards water. I think the main help for it had been working with light first. See, usually I'll work with the dark and then cut back into it with the light. But the shadows here were hard to see whenever I tried to work that way. So I instead began working with the light instead and doing it in reverse. It began with the white lines, meant to be where the light hit and also more of a guide rather than something that stayed in the piece. Keeping it soft kind of worked in my favour with those ones, especially because I wasn't trying to create a sense of power to it. It was once I had the light that the shadows began to work with the contrast, as it helped push that sense of the ripple in the piece. It also helped since the shadows below the objects in the water and above were loose. I kept the motions more expressive and more of a scribble than I would allow myself. But I was allowing myself to have fun and giving it a sense of subtle distortion without pushing too far. It was one of the experiments that I figured I could always go back and fix later if I didn't like how it looked. So besides that, I decided halfway through to try a technique I often see other people use for water and softer waves, to kind of cement what it is and add a bit of a border. In parts, not all the way around. I often have come across people using a blob of white that they then remove from to create the uneven lines that come across as part of the waves, or just general texture of water. It's something I've wanted to try for a while now, yet never done a piece where it would fit. But for this context, it worked really well once I'd lowered the opacity a little and set it below the water layer, oddly enough. It faded in well and stopped competing for attention quite as much, whilst adding visual interests to the side. Otherwise, the only remaining challenge with the water had then been finding a way of doing it, where there were parts below the layer and also above, since I usually would split it all into different layers and sections and folders. But with this image, it just wasn't a choice. If I had split them, then I would have ended up with some nightmarish outcome that would have either convinced me to restart where I was, or at least consider pushing the drawing back further back and doing something else instead. I kind of went into the drawing though knowing that the water would be my biggest fight. Though in the end it actually sorted itself out in the sketch. I've touched on that one, yet when it came to sketching the water, I used my usual pencil to add a wash over it, and then lowered the opacity accordingly on a new layer. Then I used a mix of a textured rubber and softer rubber to remove where it's needed. That was something that I was figured I could do for the sketch and then work out how I'd actually do it later on. Yet, that was then the process I used in the flat colours when it came to doing that area. So really it wasn't much of a challenge for me in the end, and I'd already done it once. I do mess with it here and there. There are parts I go back and forth with, whether on or off camera, yet it really became just another section I would work on, like the skin or dress. Which, hey, I will take it. I was rather happy with the way it came out too, even if I second-guessed myself more often than not. Like, I kept questioning how the back of the head would work, since sometimes I thought it would look better if it was slightly lifted from the water, yet then preferred it as if it was tilted back slightly so there's a subtle edge of the water around it. If that makes any sense. It sorted itself out anyway, and I'm rather happy and almost proud of it. See, when I had this dream, I had a different set of skills and level of them. I was in the sketchbooks that I now dared not to look at, since I hate every piece of art in them. Any artist will have a sketchbook like that. My mum has most of them stored away somewhere, so I don't see them either. Since also with the dream when I had it, I didn't paint either with anything other than watercolours. Even then, the watercolour was used for large bases, and I then added pencil over top of it, since I found it easier and it looked nicer than just relying on one material. But I had wanted to create it. I wanted to make the image I saw as I saw it, but didn't quite manage it. I do remember just moving on, looking at a new idea and developing that instead, since it was a challenge, but one that was more approachable in that moment. So to have this image I saw those years ago finally made, I am rather happy with myself. If I had time, I was at a place to do it a while ago. If I'm honest with myself, I could have done it before now. But the issue then was that I'd held on to the idea for so long that it felt unapproachable, since it had always been that goal that I was just too far away from. It was the project that would look so cool once done, yet one I wouldn't be ready for. So when I could have made it, I convinced myself to instead move on with another idea and turn focus elsewhere, simply because I didn't draw water that often, or how I would do certain aspects of it. Yet I am finally glad that I sat down and approached it. If ideas are always held at a pedestal, then they'll never be done, and they'll never be attainable. It is something I often need to remind myself of. But this has given me the confidence to approach other dreams and to explore various options for ideas. I suppose it's the challenge of changing the mindset to one where the result doesn't need to be perfect and doesn't really need to be exactly as I hope. They just need to be. Like, in this one I really enjoyed the process of experimenting, since I already knew it was an idea I wanted to mess with. Anyway, I want to keep the reflective bit a little shorter this time. There are just things I would rather not get into in that realm, so that is enough said. The short of it all is that progress is good but hard to see sometimes, and experimenting is always fun. Though that does leave me with very few things left to say in the list. But before I do run out of things to say here, or time, whichever happens first, I do want to say that the A5 prints of this image will be available on my Etsy. This time I will leave a link to them below in the description for you, if you're interested. I mentioned in the Sins video that prints were available, yet writing this in the script is what reminded me to add that link to the description, so yeah, I will remember this time. Hopefully. The main reason it's via Etsy at the moment is because that's the best choice for me, all factors considered. But yes, the prints of the piece are available if you would be interested in it. We are getting towards the end of my talking points, which may mean we end up slightly going into a section of music towards the end, depending on the time left when I'm editing. Otherwise, I will work something out. I must have by now if you've seen this video. Though momentarily, I do want to waffle a little on how excited I am for this series a little more. I know I've already touched on it, but I'm going to touch on it again. See, I have some ideas coming up soon that may look like dreams, yet aren't exactly dreams, and they're planned for the upcoming weeks. Yet, after that, I have so many dreams recorded for inspiration. And yes, this series will include nightmares. I did mention I'm not a fan of drawing gore, so those will be a fun challenge, both to convey the atmosphere and to find alternate routes where the ideas do include gore. But this is something that had been in the works for a while. I've had the sketch sat waiting as I did a few of my other drawings, and I've mentioned this briefly. So I am happy to have this finally out, and be able to turn to the next idea in the series to get that started between the other videos. Like, I always sort of have the videos in mind a few weeks before they're out. Next week is an exception. I have a few ideas that could be ready for next week's video, so it's just picking which one I want to edit and work on first. And to just clarify, I am still exploring all of my other ideas around here. I am currently working out character designs for different aesthetics, which, yes, has been done before, but is something I want to experiment with. I don't know at this moment when that video will be coming out, but it is on the list of things to do. It could be next week, it could be in a couple of weeks. And a little sneak peek on it, I am currently looking at a lot of cottagecore stuff, as inspired by a friend, but that is all I will say on it. I have to save most of the talking points for that video, after all. That all being said, I think I have fully run out of things to say for today. I have tried, almost all week, to think of extra things to say and other areas to touch on, but it's getting close to the upload date and I do want to finish this in time. In my defence, I did think this video would be much, much shorter, and then found it got away from me, but I'd already wrote most of the script by the time that I'd realised. So I hope you enjoy whatever music follows for the rest of the video. I am still happy I filled most of it. Being said, I will give you my thanks now for watching. I hope you enjoy these videos as much as I enjoy making them, and I do hope you have a good rest of your day or night or whatever time it may be. But thank you so much for watching, and I will hope to see you next time.